Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new pottery wrench stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
First one is titled, I catfished a former boss to get paid. I used to work for a married couple who owned a business services, public relations agency. It lasted more or less for a year. They seemed nice and humble, but in reality they were shady and untruthful. The company began to falter. They paid us only a portion of our salaries, incomplete weekly payments. Employees would run for the hills once they found a better job. Some of us were stuck. It was horrible. Then, they would pay the normal rate for a month and then do it again. They never cut down on their luxury expenses, so the wife would post her shopping sprees or arrive in a new car like it was nothing. The husband was obsessed with making it big time. He lined his office walls with posters of Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. My best friend's ex is into coding and programming and he agreed to help. If it didn't work out, at least we would have something to laugh about. We created a fake website with a matching LinkedIn and the whole 9 yards. To make a long story short, this was supposed to be an investment company and my friend would be very casual. Nothing too eager. He started by liking my employer's FB page. Then comment. Before we knew, my boss took the bait. They exchanged emails and he was eager to share all his projects and ambitious crap. On the other side, the investor sent him a list of requirements, like proof of concept, employer payroll, in-hash, etc. Within 3 weeks, I was paid the equivalent to the 2 months and a half I was owed. The investor did a face out and never contacted him again. I left the job as soon as I could. My friend who remained until she got paid told me our boss seemed off and a bit down after he announced big things are coming, but it all seemed to deflate. I never disclosed what was really going on. Edit, my boss wasn't scammed into paying money to the fake website. He was catfished into getting up to date with employee salaries that he owed. Next one is titled, Don't Be a Jerk, It Could Cost You $15,000. This happened a few years ago. I, 30 male, was living in a college town. While attending college I found out I loved pottery, ended up taking 3 pottery classes and really going for it. Found it therapeutic and fun and had some good people around me. After college I wanted to continue making pottery, but startup costs are high. So I joined a local clay co-op so I could use their facilities and kilns and space and such. The clay co-op was mostly older folks, as most ceramics people are, average age probably around 60 to 65. Me being younger and good would help do manual tasks like loading and unloading the kiln, hard for older people, and I just like helping, and I would help out around the shop and in general was a good co-op member. At the time I was working full-time in construction and would come into the studio late at night and would always have the whole place to myself. The one thing that I did wrong that apparently upset people is I would have a couple of beers while doing pottery. Note that this college town is in the south, and most everybody at the studio was old school Bible Belt gossip type people. I would never leave the shop a mess, never get drunk, just a couple beers while I worked. One day while walking by the trash can, one of the ladies, let's call her Karen, noticed an empty beer can or 2 in the bottom of the trash can. Next co-op meeting Karen brings it up. Karen was an officer for the co-op and boom, new rule, no alcohol while in the studio. I object in the meeting, politely. Back and forth. Alcohol is dangerous around clay and machinery. I said something along the lines of, it's a pottery wheel not a bulldozer. But I'm overruled by the old Southern Baptist crowd. I still drink at nights, but take my empties with me. Then one night one of the older ladies comes in, sees a beer, and goes straight to Karen. Tension increases. I stop drinking on studio. Whatever, I think, I'll just stop. I move on. It isn't worth it. Then comes time for me to move back to my hometown. It's the last day of the month. I have a handful of pieces to finish off. And membership is due every month. It's a super chill place, and I started paying membership on the 15th. So on my head I think I have until the 15th to finish my work. I knew I would be done by the 7th. Perfect, I think. I go in on the 1st and my shelf is empty. All my work is gone. My unfired, fragile, still just clay pieces are gone. Karen has taken them to the office, saying if I want to fire them I will have to pay for another month, but since I'm moving, they didn't think I would pay, so they took my pieces onto the office and hid them. A completely crazy move. I got my pieces back and fired and finished them at a friend's studio. But everybody that I talked to said this was insane, said everybody was always late on paying dues, and shocked that I had been singled out like this. I stayed calm, collected myself, and planned my revenge. Karen made pottery too, of course. She liked making pieces that had a special logo on them. A logo that represented the college from this college town. And I suspected that she did not have their permission to make something based on their copyrighted work. I called the school, got in touch with the legal office, told them everything, left it, moved out, never looked back. A few weeks ago I happened to run into one of the other co-op people. And she told me that Karen was fined $15,000, had to pay annually to use the logo, and a % of her sales back to the college. My friend laughed her head off and said many people thought it was fair treatment and justice for the way I was treated. Don't mess with my stuff and I won't mess with yours. Last one is titled, Shitty Neighbor Bullies Struggling Immigrants for 15 Years. Their kid gets revenge, and the shitty neighbor loses custody of her kid and is forced to move out of their house. With an update. A bit of context first. I'm an only child, born in the USA to older parents, they were both 45 when I was born, who immigrated from Venezuela in the 90s. When I was 2, my dad was shot in the head. He lived for another 13 years, but the incident permanently damaged certain parts of his brain, and he was a completely different person for those last 13 years. He went from being the most loving, incredible, caring, compassionate person around, to an aggressive, violent, a hole who blew up over the smallest things, but only ever at his inner circle, me, my mother, or other close family. He always managed to keep his composure around strangers for fear of someone calling the police and him getting arrested, but he would later let it all out on my mum and myself, admittedly mostly me. After the shooting, he could never work again, and my mum was forced into the position of being the family's sole breadwinner. We lived in poverty for many, many years, because the USA wouldn't recognize her college degree and she couldn't afford to go to college again, so she couldn't work in her field and had to start at the bottom of the ladder. Dad eventually died when I was 15, of issues related to his shooting. Now, when I was 7, my parents decided to move into a town with a better reputation for their schools than the one we were currently living in, so that I could attend a better school. They bought a house literally on the edge of town. Most of this town is incredibly expensive, but because on the other side of our street and across the town line, there's a big complex of government-subsidized housing, our area is much cheaper. This is the house with the a-hole neighbor. The house is a 3-family. For the last 16 years, we have owned and occupied the first floor, while the terrible neighbor lived on the second floor until recently. The third floor has been occupied by over 10 owners and tenants over these years. None have stayed more than 3 or 4 years and some have stayed as little as a handful of months. Now, the second floor, which, let's call her Karen. Because, obviously, she has a husband, who we'll call Bill, and they have a young son, Henry. Here's the story. When we moved in, Karen and Bill had already been here for a few short months. The three of us on the first floor, Karen and Bill on the second, and the original third floor's owners bought the house from the same crew, who had bought it and turned it into a 3-family, fixing it up in the process. Karen quickly showed her true colors as a bully. Over the years, there have been countless examples of nasty crap she's pulled. Her husband, Bill, is an immigrant himself, and doesn't speak very good English. He's very submissive to her and does whatever she wants, but in front of other people makes himself out to be physically dominant. In our first years here, they used to fight a lot, which we regularly heard from downstairs. They would yell, sometimes for hours, and occasionally it seemed like things got violent. Henry was born maybe 10 years ago. He doesn't factor into the story until much later. But anyways, the point is, whatever Karen's done, she's always gotten away with it. Here are a couple highlights. My mum always took pride in how well she took care of our trash bin and recycling bin. Every month she'd give them a quick rinse after that week's trash day, just to make sure that they wouldn't develop a smell or a colony of bacteria wouldn't move in. Karen, apparently, wasn't so diligent, and one time, her recycling bin got really nasty. And I mean really nasty. So, she just left it out back. Context: behind the house isn't a backyard, it's just pavement with a parking spot designated for each unit, and began using ours. Lo and behold, ours started to get nasty, and Mum quickly went from spending a quick 3 minutes rinsing it out every month to about 45 minutes scrubbing with soap and water to clean it out. Eventually, we decided we'd had enough, and she and Dad sent Karen and the third-floor tenants of the time a polite but firm email that basically said, "Whoever started using our recycling bin, please stop and use your own. You never asked our permission, and we take good care of it, and ever since you began using it, it's become disgusting." We knew it was Karen and Bill, but Mum and Dad figured it was more polite without a call out, and they didn't want to start anything. Within a week, two things happened. Karen and Bill got a brand spanking new recycling bin, and 1 week we found ours had been mysteriously destroyed. Someone took a knife to it and cut it to pieces. We had no way of knowing who it was, but we had a pretty good feeling we knew exactly who it was. Yes, we had to get a new one. Because we had no evidence of who did it though, my parents didn't say anything about it. Back when we could afford a car, we haven't had one since our first few years here, we used our parking space out back. Every time that Karen and Bill hosted a party, which back then was surprisingly frequently, they would toss their trash over their balcony into the general vicinity of the trash and recycling bins out back, which is literally right next to our designated parking space. Most of the dents we had on our old '88 Toyota were from bottles thrown from the second-floor balcony. We had windows break a couple times, same deal. Each time it happened, my parents would politely go upstairs, knock on Karen and Bill's door, and respectfully ask them to stop throwing stuff over the balcony because, "We know you don't mean it, but sometimes it accidentally hits our car." Each time they went and did that, Karen and Bill stopped, but they would do it again until they got caught during their next party. Again though, my parents never wanted to escalate the situation, so they never justified taking it further than knocking on her door and politely asking them to stop. This is another example of Karen's utter crap behavior, but it's also relevant for the revenge part of the story, so I'm putting it after the bullet point section. Our basement is shared between all 3 units. Each unit has its designated space boxed out kind of like office cubicles, and there's some designated common area in between. Years ago, maybe like 8 or 9, Karen and Bill completely filled their designated basement cubicle, so they just started piling crap all over the common area. Eventually, they developed this enormous pile of junk in front of Unit 1's, our unit oil tank, for heating. My mum and dad never said anything because it happened over a long period of time and they didn't want to start a fight, and as far as I know none of the third-floor folks ever said anything either, but it got to the point where she and her husband were taking up common area space that was easily twice the size of their designated cubicle. Now, I'll be the first to admit that for many years my parents and I weren't great neighbors, either. We didn't bully anyone, but due to my dad's condition, he could be triggered by seemingly anything, and suddenly he'd be in a rage and we'd all be yelling. I grew up in that generally chaotic environment, and, yeah, there were several times when the police were called to our house for noise disturbances. But we kept our crap to ourselves, and we were nothing but polite and respectful to all our neighbors, always. That said, you can imagine that our first priority was always my dad and his stability, and we had enough on our hands with that, so he and mum always swallowed their pride and avoided doing anything to antagonize Karen, no matter how shitty her behavior got. And believe you me, there are plenty more stories on top of the ones I told above. After my dad died, I developed my own issues for a while, with mental health. Growing up in a constantly chaotic, violent, aggressive environment took its toll on me, and for a time I had deeply depressive tendencies. I struggled with suicidality for years, and eventually wound up graduating high school after 8 years of attending classes in some form or another. Similar to when my dad was sick, I became my mother's top priority at that point, so again, Karen and Bill kept getting away with all her bullcrap. I got better though. Nowadays, I'm even off my psychiatric medication. I got my crap together and graduated high school, and even college. I have my bachelor's, and I'm doing some postgrad stuff for a master's. Most of the way has been paid for by scholarships. But I recently decided that, as an adult now and therefore as someone with a little more say in things around the house than when I was a kid, I had had enough of watching Karen bully my parents, particularly my mother, for so many years. I wanted revenge. Phase 1 of my plan was to ease my way into the adult condo administration dialogue. I began helping out more around the house, as in, around the common area parts of the house. 1. I single-handedly redid the back porch's flooring. It sounds like more than it is. I just pulled out all the floorboards and nailed new ones in. 2. I replaced both storm doors about 6 months apart when each one began having problems, different kinds of problems, it doesn't matter what they were. 3. I also took care of some comparatively smaller things. I weed-whacked out back for a couple hours, cut the grass out front a few times, and got up early so that I could beat everyone else to the shoveling every time it snowed one winter, not 18 to 19, but 17 to 18. I also began wheeling back everyone's recycling and trash bins after trash week every week, not just our own. After the first 2 bullet point stuff, each time I sent out an email to everyone in the condo to let them know that I had taken care of it, and that all I asked of the other 2 units was for them to reimburse me 1/3 road of the cost of materials, on their timetable, because of course I hadn't given them a heads up, so it was only fair that I allow them to pay me when they can. The smaller stuff from the last bullet point I obviously didn't need to announce. The idea was just that over time, the neighbors would see me taking more initiative in things and being more active, which would go on to justify me participating more in inter-condo politics. I also made a point to keep conversations to emails, so that there would be a written record of every interaction. Phase 2 of my plan ran pretty much concurrently to Phase 1, but had an entirely different purpose and was overall entirely different. I began gathering evidence of everything I could. 1. I asked my mum to track down all the old emails she and Dad had exchanged with the neighbors, documenting many instances that Karen and Bill had pulled crap. 2. I went downstairs and took a video of Karen and Bill's shit all over the common area, particularly emphasizing all the highly flammable wooden and cardboard crap they had piled up in front of our oil tank. 3. I dug up and pored over the deed to our apartment, specifically the sections that detailed the rules around common areas and the limitations of our unit as compared to the others and vice versa. 4. To my utter joy, Mum and Dad never threw out that old recycling bin that Karen and/or Bill had knifed up, apparently because they just never knew what to do with it and never wanted anyone to ask questions. Naturally, I dug it up and took plenty of photos. 5. I did one other evidence-gathering thing that needs a bit more explanation. Karen and Bill are awful parents. Mum and I regularly hear the shit they do to Henry through the very thin ceiling we have here. I'm decidedly not going to go into detail because, even though I changed his name, he's still underage and I feel it would be disrespectful to him to do that, but let's say it crosses far into the realm of child abuse. This is a topic I'm particularly sensitive about because I grew up in a shitty situation myself, so believe me when I say this part is the most satisfying part of my revenge. Let's just say that every time I could hear shit through the ceiling, I took out my phone and started a recording until it stopped. Finally, Phase 3 of my plan was basically to bait Karen and/or Bill into a trap I set that, as it turns out, would have humongous consequences for them. Mum and I have this old treadmill that we got for free. It's in the kitchen, and lately we've come to the conclusion that it just takes up a little too much space. We both use it a little, but not enough to justify keeping it. She wanted to toss it out, but I argued hard to keep it around, because I knew I could use it for this plan. It would be my only shot. Remember how I mentioned we haven't had a car for years? Well, eventually, I convinced Mum to let me put the treadmill outside, in our parking space out back. I bought a large tarp to cover it with, so it would be protected from the rain, and I told her I'd start using it more if it was outside because it's nicer to do exercise in the fresh air. I also sent out an email to Karen, CC'd to Bill and the current 3rd floor folks, asking her to move all the things in front of our oil tank in the basement, somewhere else. Despite the fact that those things had been there for many years, I justified addressing it now because I'm the one addressing it, and that's different from before because before I was a child and now I'm an adult who actively participates in the inter-condo dialogue. I asked her to because the way she currently had it set up is a safety hazard, and I'm just following the rules. I further let her know that if she and Bill didn't take care of it within a handful of weeks, that I would have no choice but to take care of it myself. In the same email, I let everyone know that I was putting our treadmill in our parking space out back, so that if anyone had any trouble with getting into their spot to please let me know. The same day I sent out the email, I put the treadmill out back. Now, I figured nothing was going to change from all the other emails I had sent about matters regarding the condo's administration, and nothing did. She and Bill never acknowledged anything. The current third-floor guy didn't want anything to do with going up against Karen, so he just thanked me for the heads up about the treadmill and said nothing else. It's also important to note here that my real reason for mentioning the treadmill in that email wasn't in case anyone has trouble getting into their parking spot. Needless to say, sure, a treadmill in a kitchen is pretty ducking big and obnoxious, but a treadmill off to the side of an automobile parking space isn't really big at all. Plus, I placed it in such a way that it wasn't in anyone's way, giving everyone ample room to maneuver around. It was just there, off to the side. The reason I mentioned the treadmill in that email was to alert her to its presence, and perhaps associate it in her mind with my request for her to move all her shit in the basement. I also began using it at least 3 mornings a week. I timed it so that sometimes, Karen and Bill would run into me as they left to drive Henry to school. Every time I saw them, I waved and greeted, to ensure they'd notice me on the treadmill. Mum also used it a few times, but she wasn't part of my plan, so I've no idea if she ever ran into them while on it. Here's the other thing I did: I set up a video camera in our laundry basket. See, we have it permanently in the pantry, next to the pantry window that faces the back area. I buried it beneath clothing so that from outside you can't even see it, but I bought a few massive memory storage-wise, not physically, SD cards and kept the thing recording 24/7, with a timestamp. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The camera recorded nothing suspicious, and Karen and Bill didn't move their crap in the basement. Their time was up, so one night, I got up at around 1 AM when everyone else was asleep so nobody would hear me, and went downstairs to move their crap. I can't express to you how much I enjoyed this. I bought a GoPro, strapped it to my noggin, and carefully recorded the entire hour and a half of moving crap around. I took the enormous pile of junk in front of Mum and I's oil tank, and found a way to fit all of it into their designated storage cubicle. In the end, it was packed. I have mild OCD and I nearly had an orgasm at the end from how well organized, physically, everything was, so that everything was neatly packed together and all the space was used at maximum efficiency. It was glorious. Packed from floor to ceiling, and almost wall to wall all around. If you can just imagine one massive, near-perfect rectangular prism of junk, that's what I had created. It was a masterpiece. I was so proud. On the side the door was on, there was enough space to walk to either wall, but you couldn't move into it anywhere. I got back upstairs to our apartment and couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I was beyond excited. I wound up watching Infinity War to prepare for Ant-Man and the Wasp's then upcoming release. Sure enough, Karen and Bill took the bait. I must have been at school or work when they first discovered the basement, because I never heard a thing about it. In hindsight, it's probably best I was out, even though I would have savored those angry shrieks like nothing ever before. In any case, within a few days, we discovered our treadmill destroyed. Similarly to the recycling bin of years past, it had been knifed up. I can imagine they probably wanted to straight up take a hammer to it, but they didn't want to make much noise, so they wound up just tearing the thing apart with a really big and really sharp knife. They had seen that we were using it, and aside from our trash and recycling bins, it was our only property that they had access to at that point. Several years back, I filled up the rest of the wall of our basement cubicle and installed a door with a lock, so our cubicle is now sealed off to everyone else, but the others are open and anyone can enter. Plus, I can imagine destroying a $1,000 treadmill is infinitely more tempting than a trash or recycling bin, so they went for it in retaliation for my stunt in the basement. After moving their crap in the basement, I started timing my treadmill use differently so that I wouldn't run into them. As soon as I saw it after they destroyed it, I went straight to the camera I had set up in the pantry. It caught the whole thing. In true fashion of their relationship, Bill brandished an enormous knife and single-handedly destroyed the whole thing himself, while she stood next to him and seemingly ordered him to do it. She basically kept pointing around at all the parts she wanted him to cut up. With that in hand, I called the police, reported the incident, told them that my mother and I felt threatened by their presence, and we filed a restraining order against both Karen and Bill with the police that same day. I turned over all the evidence I had gathered of all their crap over the years, and I also turned over all the audio clips I had of Karen and Bill Terrace Zero rizzing Henry. I figured since it was all audio and no video, it wouldn't be enough to get him out of their care, but maybe it'd at least get the Department of Children and Families involved. Karen and Bill immediately claimed that I had broken a bunch of their crap while moving it around in the basement, shit that they no doubt had broken themselves, so I offered my GoPro recordings as proof that I had not, in fact, broken any of their shit while moving it at all. The restraining order a person is allowed to file with a police report is always temporary, but you can always petition the court to extend it. Once Mum and I did that, it was granted. At that point, Karen and Bill hadn't been legally allowed to go back home for about a week, and since it became a longer-term restraining order, they were basically not going to be allowed to live in their own home for several years, so they made the obvious choice to sell the house and move elsewhere. Needless to say, selling a house you're not allowed to be near is a difficult task, and moving all your stuff out of said house is even more difficult, particularly when you have so much of it. They wound up coordinating the entire house's sale from afar, with their realtor being the only person who came around to show the house. Once it was time for them to move, some relatives of theirs came around and packed everything up and loaded it into a truck. Also, I was right, based on my recordings alone, Henry wasn't taken from their custody, but DCF did get involved. I heard from their family that came around to pack up their crap though that Karen and Bill did wind up losing custody of him. They didn't say much as to why, but they basically implied that the abuse ramped up a lot after everything went down between me and Karen and Bill, which is the only part one feel guilty about, but in the end I hope this is a situation where the end justifies the means, at which point DCF was already sniffing around, so they wound up losing custody of him anyways. I've no idea where Henry wound up, but wherever he is I obviously have nothing against him and I hope he winds up in a much better situation than he was. Finally, I will say, for two such inordinately obtuse and disgusting human beings, they had surprisingly decent family members. The few times I ran into them and made small talk when they were around, they were pretty apologetic about the whole thing. I got the impression that this isn't the first time they're apologizing on Karen and Bill's behalf. I hope Henry is taken in by one of them, and not chucked into the foster system. Here's hoping, kid. Update. Karen lost her job. Or, at least, she's not working where she had been anymore. I assume she was fired, or at least that it had something to do with what went down, but I don't actually have a way to know. I got curious though, after posting this here, because I remembered she worked as a guidance counselor at a school a few towns away, and I figured if the school had found out that DCF took her kid, they might not have wanted her there anymore, and I may have been right. Anyways though, I got curious, so I asked a friend to ring the school's secretary and asked to be transferred to the guidance department, where they asked for Karen's desk. She, my friend, said the guidance secretary just matter-of-factly said, "I'm sorry, that staff member is no longer employed here," and that was that. Seeing as this all went down at the end of the 17 to 18 school year, I'm guessing they just replaced her at the beginning of this school year. The school's website lists one of the guidance counselors as having started working there this school year. Of course, I have no real way to know if she was fired, nor even if her leaving that position had anything to do with me and my revenge, but it seems like very odd timing if there was no correlation. Admittedly, it's also entirely possible that Karen resigned or left her post of her own volition, whether it be to make selling the house and moving easier or just to start over, who the hell knows. Thanks for listening.